So I'm really excited about you joining us. It looks like we want to get all of our different technologies going. It looks like our stream is going live on Facebook and on YouTube. So for those of you who are joining us in those places, we're just about to get started in another minute or so. So now's a great opportunity, if you haven't done so already, to go ahead, share the live stream, share it on YouTube or Facebook, because you just never know who might see it and who might, who might be blessed. I'm going to go ahead and turn my volume down so I don't have an echo, but who might get an idea or inspiration because you've shared it. So go ahead, take a minute to do that. I'm going to make sure I share as well from my page. And so again, we're streaming live on YouTube and on Facebook. Our streaming ID for social media is 316DC, and 316 is spelled out. You should be able to find us. We hope that you will be able to join us weekly. And so go ahead and take the time to subscribe, update your notifications, all that good stuff. You know, we're all going to be like amazing technology gurus when all of this is done, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to, to be able to interact and engage with different people throughout the globe. And so let's see. We're going to go ahead. I'm going to just post in one other place so that I can see this. And we're going to go ahead. So again, today we're going to be talking about affordable housing. We have Shiri Yadlin. Go ahead and tell me your last name again so I make sure I pronounce it correctly.
Yeah, Shiri Yadlin.
Okay, so Shiri is here. Shiri's with Just Homes, and we're going to talk more about what they do. Just Homes is a program or organization that's founded by the District Church in DC. And so, this is a very important topic this week because we just know how many people are affected by housing. If they weren't, we had a sort of a crisis even before the pandemic, but even now more so because of the pandemic, we're in a situation where housing is touching everyone, even if it's not your household. I'm sure each one of us knows someone who's behind on their rent, behind on their mortgage, and being affected. And so we want to make sure that we get this important word out. And so, all right, so let's go ahead and get started. All right, so again, welcome everybody. My name's Shawn Jegede. I am with the founder and CEO of 316 DC. We're a consulting organization based out of DC, but we actually operate in multiple places, including both in and outside of the United States. And our goal is to create these partnerships across sectors where we're able to together address these longstanding and challenging community issues, right? But the thing that makes us unique or very specific is that we like to work and establish partnerships that have faith-based organizations at their core, because I, as an ordained pastor, like to just believe from my experience that the faith community is integrated already into the community and has a unique opportunity and advantage to be able to touch multiple families that sometimes government agencies or other programs aren't able to reach. And so I'm glad to have you. Last week we launched. So today is our second live stream, Wisdom Sparks. It's a weekly live stream. And the whole idea is to just get together, share our stories, share wisdom that we've gained over these years in doing this kind of work, with the hope that it's going to spark wisdom and ideas in other people. So ideas and inspiration. So today, as I shared, we have Shiri Yadlin from Just Homes, which is an organization that focuses on affordable housing within the Washington, D.C. area. But I'm glad that people are streaming in from other places as well, because the ideas and the model that Just Homes is using can really be applied in villages, cities, metropolitan areas throughout the world. There are some key concepts that I think are applicable. And so I'm glad that she's here today. So Shiri, tell us a little bit about what you do at Just Homes and about yourself and kind of how you decided that that was the right role for you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. This is really fun. I was really inspired last week by Rev Cheney, so I'm excited to be part of the group, sharing ideas and learning from each other. So, Just Homes, as you said, is an initiative of the District Church in Washington, D.C., and we mobilize and equip faith communities across the city to respond to the affordable housing crisis. And that sounds a little broad, but it's sort of intentionally broad, recognizing that churches sit in different places and have different resources and can do different things. And so what one church does to engage in the housing space is going to look different from what another church does, but everyone has a role to play. And we at Just Homes try to help churches figure that out and give them the resources and the tools and the connections, and we sort of act as an educator and a convener, sort of providing resources, but also bringing faith communities together to sort of do this work collaboratively, recognizing that there are great efforts already from churches across the region working to address the affordable housing crisis. And so sort of lifting up and encouraging the work that they're doing, but also bringing other churches to the table as the district church was trying to figure out, how do we get involved with addressing the very real affordable housing needs of the city. We saw that there were lots of other churches that were also asking that question. So we sort of saw a place for an entity to be bringing these folks together, to be helping other churches answer that question of how do we get involved, just as we as the district church were trying to do that too. So this is really, for me, kind of a ideal role, because my background is in housing. I worked in sort of a social work kind of case management capacity with people experiencing homelessness in DC for a number of years. And I have a graduate degree in public policy. And so sort of affordable housing, homelessness, the sort of systems and policies surrounding housing is the passion area of mine in my professional life. But then my faith community has been a huge part of my life too. And so the fact that I get to sort of meld these things and working on housing in the faith community is sort of the ideal mix.
Awesome. You're going to also see, we live in real life. So to my audience, this is spring break for us. So I'm multitasking as mom and a leader of Wisdom Spark. So you're going to see me mute my microphone in between, just because I've got two teenagers in the background. And so hopefully that won't be too disruptive. So thank you so much, Shiri. I mean, we really are in the midst of a housing crisis, both in Washington, D.C. and in other places. And prior to the pandemic, housing was a huge issue. And we know that housing in and of itself isn't an isolated issue. Affordable housing has been proven to impact violence, gun violence, poverty, health, mental health, physical health. The person's ability to be able to access affordable, safe housing has an impact on every other area of their life. So I'm really glad that the district church and Just Homes are approaching this issue, because as people of faith, we know that we can't just speak, we're not just speaking to a person's spirit, but we know that their lives and the things that touch them affect their spirit as well. And so I'm glad that you're doing this. Yeah. Speaking of district church, tell us a little bit about the church. And I will say, I know your senior pastor, Pastor Aaron Graham. He and I had the opportunity to do some things together when we were in Boston, Massachusetts. And from what I know about district church and the advocacy that you guys do on an everyday level, and the service, the different ways that you provide service to the community, it makes sense for you to be doing something like this. But for those who don't know, tell us a little bit about the church and why this is a good fit for you guys.
Yeah, absolutely. So the district church just celebrated our 10th year anniversary last fall. So been around for 10 years. And really since the church was started by pastors Aaron and Amy Graham in 2010, it's been a church that has sought to meet the needs of the city, and those, the spiritual needs certainly, but also just the physical, material, social needs of the city. And so the church is kind of constantly looking for what are we hearing from the people around us, from those in our neighborhood, from our communities. And a sort of persistent need that has always been there from the beginning has been affordable housing. About 7 years ago, the church launched a foster care and adoption ministry that has now spun off and become its own nonprofit. So, these are the kinds of things that the church tries to do, recognizing when there is a need and one that the church can meet or that the church can help meet, recognizing that, there's great organizations doing fabulous work on all of these issues. So like, how can we do our part as a church? What resources do we have to sort of fill the gaps that exist? As you said, churches are parts of communities. Churches have a kind of obligation and responsibility to care for the communities around them. And so the district church certainly tries to do that with our general outreach ministries, but then also with some of these sort of signature ministries that we start focused on a specific issue, really trying to, again, do our part to fill the gaps that exist in the community.
Awesome. Yeah, so why housing? I'm glad that you talked too about the foster care program that you have, that district church is involved in. There's so many different ways that churches, and we say churches, but it's also people of faith, right? Because sometimes it could be an effort that's happening through your overall organization, but sometimes it can also be an individual effort that people are working on in your own capacity, like in your community, just as a good neighbor or as a community advocate. So for people and individuals of faith, there's so many different ways that we can contribute to the community. There's food needs and housing and nutrition and health. What is it about housing that attracted your attention or the organization's attention? And how have you seen housing impact the community where you guys are?
Yeah, great question. So the first thing I'll say is think about your daily life and the things that you do throughout the day. Go to work, go to school, buy groceries, cook food, etc. And think about, if you don't have a safe and stable place to call home, how much harder it is to do all of those things, how much lonelier it feels, how much more stressful it is, how much, unhealthy, how unhealthy it is. Like, this housing really is sort of, you can think about it anecdotally, but also statistically, we have data on this, that housing really is a foundation for a healthy, thriving, stable life. It's a real foundation for a healthy life. And it's just enough to have housing, but safe and stable and secure and affordable housing. Like, these things are completely foundational to a life where one can thrive. And so that's sort of, for me, why housing has always been sort of the issue. And I think when we look at it more on this church level, think about sort of these very biblical concepts of sort of like belonging, of wholeness, of sanctuary, of at Just Homes, we talk about biblical justice as the state of wholeness and flourishing that's due all of God's creation. Like, there is this ideal, like the vision of Just Homes is a just city where everyone has a home. And if you close your eyes and try to picture a vision of a just city, everyone having a safe and stable place that is theirs, that they can retreat to, that they can feel secure, they can feel welcome, that they can feel like that is a key part of this vision of a just place, that sort of where all of God's creation can thrive and feel whole. And so housing sort of becomes that key issue, at least for me. Again, and it's all related. Like, housing is healthcare, is food security, is all of these things are interconnected. So really, when you address one issue, you're kind of addressing all of it, because you need to address all of it. So that's sort of why housing. And then, we see in Washington, D.C., you said there are people, watching from across the country, and really the entire country is experiencing a housing crisis. There's been new data actually just released last week from the National Low Income Housing Coalition that shows there's not a single state in the entire country that has an adequate supply of affordable housing for extremely low income renters. There's a shortage of over 7 million homes across the country for this population. In DC specifically, the existing supply of affordable housing meets only half the need for extremely low income households. So those are basically households at the poverty line. So really, this is an issue everywhere. You kind of touched on this idea that the pandemic has kind of almost made this worse, and we don't have great data on that yet, because in many places an eviction moratorium is still is still in effect. So people haven't been losing their homes at the rate that we fear they might. Most housing advocates are sort of kind of bracing themselves for a wave of more housing challenges. So this is, like many issues, we're seeing that the pandemic has kind of only exacerbated the existing like challenges that we're facing, and housing is certainly no different from that.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. And so, I mean, it's huge, right? It seems like this Goliath that when you talk about affordable housing, because the problem is just so massive. You talked about the millions of homes that we are short of. And so I'm a church, or say I belong to a church. I'm a member of a church in a community where I know that affordable housing is an issue. And there may be other people within my congregation or my mosque or my temple, wherever people are. There may be people who I know, while they have their homes now, as soon as the moratorium is lifted, they're going to be evicted. So what could I, as a person of faith or an organization of faith, how could I benefit from the resources or the practice of just homes? Like, where would I even start?
Yeah. So I'm actually going to back up to something that Rev Cheney said last week. One of the things that she said that really stood out to me was she talked about sort of using the gifts that God gave her in ministry and in all aspects of her life, and sort of starting from those gifts and using those gifts to then go out in the world and sort of, and believing in herself and those gifts that God gave her. And I actually, that stood out to me because it was very inspiring, but also because it really is one of the things that we encourage for houses of worship as they're thinking about, it is easy to get overwhelmed by the magnitude of the problem because it's a big problem. So then we take a step back and think like, okay, but we can't do everything. So what can we do? No one can do everything, but everyone can do something. So let's figure out what that something is. And when houses of worship are trying to figure out what that something is, I encourage them to ask themselves a couple of questions. The first question is, what are my assets? What resources do I, as a faith community, have to offer? Maybe those resources are financial resources. Maybe they're land resources. Maybe your house of worship has land that you can use to develop affordable housing. Maybe those resources are personnel resources. Maybe your community has lawyers who can be volunteering in eviction cases.
Wow.
Maybe your community has homeowners who have basements that they can convert into affordable housing units. Maybe your community has just longstanding residents who are taxpayers who can be using their voice to advocate for favorable policies in their community. In DC, the budget process is happening, and the budget is a huge place where that is sort of making or breaking the future of affordable housing in the city. And so as a DC resident, you can use your voice to advocate for budget priorities that advance affordable housing development. There are so many different ways that you can get involved. So start by just thinking like, who are we as a faith community? Who am I as an individual? Everyone has something to offer. You may not think you do, but you do. So think about what are your resources. And then the second thing that you want to ask is, what does my community need? Like, is it people who need rental assistance? Is there a problem with senior housing? We need more affordable housing for seniors. Is it youth that are homeless in my community? So think about what is it that your community needs. Maybe, as houses of worship, you probably have relationships with other organizations, maybe schools or community centers or faith or other leaders in your community. If you don't have those relationships, that's a great place to start, is by trying to build some of those relationships. Because we don't want to be going in assuming that there are needs out there when we don't really know what they are. So kind of first step, figuring out what you have to offer. Second step, figuring out what the needs are. And then the third one is, prayerfully considering like, God, where are you calling me to use these resources to meet these needs? Like, where's the match here? And kind of thinking through the process that way. And that's one of the things that we do at Just Homes, is kind of help guide faith communities through that process and ask questions and prompt sort of reflection, help them with making connections with the community that they need. Once they're thinking about, well, here's some of the things that maybe we can do, we help them find resources of other organizations that they can partner with to help make this happen. So in some cases, that looks like helping churches figure out how they can develop affordable housing. Sometimes it's doing trainings for congregations on advocacy and on neighboring and on other sorts of issues. So we sort of, this is kind of a reflection process that houses of worship or individuals need to go through, but they don't have to go through it alone. We sort of help them figure that out.
And I love that. I mean, thank you so much. I love that you've thought about it. You have people within your congregation. You've worked in housing yourself. You have people with expertise that's specific to the challenge, right? Affordable housing. We know housing has regulations, all of those things. And so I like that you've broken it down into sort of these bite-sized pieces that people of faith can say, okay, this is where I start, right? Let me start with this. It's kind of like the 2 fish and the 5 loaves, right? Mm-hmm. You start with what you have. And when we start multiplying it, when we start, matching that with the needs of the community, we realize how quickly it multiplies. Yeah. I really love also that Just Homes has a foot in both worlds, sometimes as the church, and faith organizations, we tend to put God in a box. We tend to think, well, the church is really meant only to minister to a person's spirit, and we need to leave those other issues up to like government agencies and things like that. And then the challenge is when organizations or faith organizations do get it, when they recognize that God is about supporting and loving the entire person with all of their needs, that it's hard to find support and guidance from people who understand what it means to be a faith organization, right? Mm-hmm. Because within our faith organization, we have particular values or approaches and ways that we're going to go about affordable housing that may be different from a different organization. So I love how Just Homes has the ability to be able to speak to both. It's sort of like translating across that. And so with that in mind as well, what would you say to the congregation, or even let's say to the pastor? Say I'm a pastor, I'm in a community. It's very obvious that there's some housing needs. Perhaps even some of my members are walking past people who are experiencing homelessness on their way to Sunday worship. Well, when we were all going to a building, but on their way, right? Or we're going to the grocery store and we see people who are experiencing homelessness, or sometimes it's not so obvious. We know that some of our own members are on the verge of homelessness, but I'm having a tough time as a leader convincing the people, my trustees or my other leaders in the congregation, that this is important enough for the church to address, right? How do we convince people of faith and other organizations of faith that housing is something that the church should be involved in?
Yeah. So I have so many thoughts.
No pressure, right?
I have so much to say. First of all, I think that the very basic, we mentioned that this is a huge problem. And frankly, we need everyone to play a role in addressing it. So does the government have a role to play? Absolutely. So do nonprofits, businesses, the private sector, the philanthropy sector, everyone has to do something because it's such a big problem. If we imagine it like this, boulder blocking a road, we got to chip away at it from every single angle. And that means the faith community, just as a part of society and part of the city, part of the community, the faith community has to play a role. Apart from that, though, I think we have a pretty clear biblical mandate to address Amen. This issue. And, you can point to scriptures calling us to love our neighbor, to welcome the stranger, care for the widow and orphan, of course, the famous Matthew 25, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat, whatever you did for the least, at least you did for me. Meeting immediate tangible needs is a pretty clear part of our biblical call. And then we also have, again, kind of going back to this idea of biblical justice, God paints a pretty clear vision throughout Old Testament prophets, throughout scripture, of that, this is not the intended design of this world. There is brokenness and there is sin and it permeates everything, but that doesn't have to be the only way. There is a vision of wholeness and of flourishing that is sort of the end game. Your kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. We pray that, for a reason. And there is a long sort of a long history throughout scripture of God working through individual humans and churches and communities and congregations to live out that vision of justice. So, God works through Moses to deliver people from slavery. God works through Esther to deliver, people from genocide. God works through the disciples to heal and clothe and feed people. So yes, this is the work that God needs to do. This is work, but we are a critical part of that. Like, broken humans sure cause a lot of the injustice of the world, but God set it up that we broken humans are also vessels of God's work to repair the brokenness of the world. And so I think that there's like a pretty clear mandate that we have, and housing is part of that. To go back to that vision of what is a just city look like, what is flourishing and honoring the image of God in everyone, what does that look like? Part of that is safe and stable housing.
Yeah. Amen. And the church has solutions, right? If we believe in a God of wisdom who has all knowledge and is all knowing, and we are God's people who have the connection to God, why wouldn't we be involved, right? We don't want to be on the sidelines expecting people to just figure it out on their own, but we want to be able to leverage the direct connection that we have with God to pray for wisdom, to give us wisdom for the peace of our cities, right? Like, we have a stake in it. And because many people of faith, we're people of faith, but we're also people of the place where we live. We're residents, we're advocates. Our children go to the schools, we and perhaps our spouses or our partners work within the workplaces. So all of these places affect not just the people around us, but they affect us on a daily basis. And we love people because we're loved by God. And the love that God has for us is not just on Sunday morning or within the four walls of a church, but it's in every moment and it's in every area of our life. So I love it. So again, for those of you who are watching, where we have Shiri Yadlin, she's with Just Homes, and it's an organization founded by the District Church in Washington, D.C., and their goal is to come alongside persons and organizations of faith to figure out what might be the right path or the right avenue to be a part of the affordable housing solution, both in Washington, D.C., and we'll make sure we put her contact information in there for you, but also around the globe. If you're like, I've got friends in Ghana, in the Netherlands, all over in the Caribbean. I can't wait to get back to some of these places. If you're sitting there and you're saying, how do we address housing within our own cultural context, reach out to us. I'll put you in touch with Shiri. I'll work with you myself, because as I said, 316, our goal is to help organizations and persons of faith connect with resources and connect with information that helps you develop a path to be able to meet the needs of the communities around you. And so thank you, Shiri. I want to sort of shift our attention to sort of the elephant in the room, right? Especially for DC, and I think for other major cities, because unfortunately, whenever we start talking about looking for ways to produce more housing, we have to address the risk of gentrification. And we know that in many cities, towns, even in rural areas, that people with more means than other groups have more choices and what seems like more power than sometimes other group. And so when people decide, if you provide affordable housing and people with more means decide, well, I want to live in that space, then sometimes it can mean that those with less means get displaced. And so I know this is important to you guys. I know it's important to your pastor, Aaron Graham. I've advocated with him in different places about it. And so how can we as the faith community contribute to producing and even making people more aware of housing that already exists without contributing to the problem of gentrification?
Yeah. I mean, this is in the sort of community development and housing space, like this is the $1 million question of how do you have economic development and improved sort of opportunity without displacement. And there's, you could have this conversation on sort of the policy level, on the social level, so it is multifaceted and complex, but on this kind of more specific, like faith level, I think there's a couple things that I want to say about it. First of all, the desire to combat gentrification and displace, specifically the displacement associated with gentrification, I think is another reason why churches need to be fully invested in the advancement of affordable housing. Because one, churches are suffering from gentrification, right? There are many churches that have had to move out of the city because the people who make up their congregation can't afford to live there anymore. And so the church is like, well, we used to have people walking to our church every Sunday. Now they have to drive in. Now they're not coming anymore. So you know what? We're just going to move our church to where everyone moved to. And that's a very common story. There's also a lot of churches who are getting calls from developers all the time saying, we want your property. We're going to offer you a lot of money for it. And that is very tempting for a church to take, especially when they're struggling financially. So this sort of development boom, the sort of boom in luxury, specifically luxury housing development, is really preying on churches. And so churches being part of the answer to that. Part of what Just Homes wants to do is help churches figure out, like, how can we stay in the city if we want to stay in the city? How can we, or if we don't want to stay in the city, how can we use our property to continue our mission in the city, even if we are, as a congregation, are meeting elsewhere? A lot of churches are trying to, those who have developed affordable housing have done so specifically to try to, because they saw that it was their community that was really struggling. A great example of this is Mount Lebanon Baptist Church, which is in the sort of Truxton Circle neighborhood of DC. Their pastor Lionel Edmonds saw that a lot of the people who had been coming to his church couldn't afford to live in the neighborhood anymore. And so he saw, like, we need affordable housing here. And he worked with lots of other organizations to take an old school and turn it into, I think it's 80 plus affordable housing units for seniors. And it is sort of and that's enabled people who have lived in that neighborhood for a long time to stay in that neighborhood and to benefit from the economic development that happened around the neighborhood while still staying there. So affordable housing, and truly affordable housing, like housing that is actually affordable, not just affordable in name, which is a huge problem. Actual affordable housing in neighborhoods that are experiencing gentrification can help kind of stem some of the effects of that. So that's sort of the more like structural piece of this. Also, because churches are located all throughout the city, like they are already in areas where affordable housing is needed, specifically areas where there is, lots of job opportunity, lots of public transportation, where there's, amenities that you need to thrive. So churches are already really well placed just geographically to be helping with the affordable housing thing. So that's sort of the sort of structural thing. The other thing I'll say is that, we as the district church, like, we're a multicultural church. We have a lot of racial diversity within our church, but we are still a pretty, like, at least, majority kind of educated young professionals, essentially like those who are more on the like causing end than the receiving end of the gentrification problem. Like, I am a young white person who did not grow up in DC, who is now trying to work on housing in DC. Like, that's a reality that, like, I need to, like, be very self-aware of and, like, explicit about whenever I am going and talking. So in kind of creating the structure of Just Homes and thinking about the programming that we do, trying to constantly, like, come at it from the standpoint of humility, to be thinking about asking questions, trying to learn from those who are already doing this work, those who have been in the community longer than I have. We have a lot of educational programming for, really it's designed for everyone, but it's kind of more geared towards white and non-DC native residents of DC to learn, like, what's the history of this city? We have a 4-part seminar called Housing, Race, and Justice, where we go into the history of Washington, the area that is now Washington, DC, and talk about the ways that housing policy and racism and justice have all kind of intertwined to become the city that we are today, because it's really important to know what existed here before you lived here, what existed in your neighborhood before you lived there, what kinds of structural issues and systemic issues were involved. So really trying to, like, we sort of lean heavily on the education element of our work in order to try to make sure that we all know where we're coming from, be really explicit about the ways in which race and justice and economic inequity and things kind of all intertwine in this, and talk about ways that we can be trying to live in the city as conscious and justice-minded residents, and combat rather than contribute to the displacement and gentrification that exists.
Yeah.
So
I love
there's a
that.
lot more to that.
I love it. I love it. As what did you say? As conscious and justice-based residents.
Yeah, conscious and justice-minded residents.
Yes, I love it. You know, and there's a number of things that you said. One that I want to touch on, and then I want to invite you to come back or to come back to it and ask how people can access that training that you talked about. But the one thing that I want to point out is that diversity does not automatically mean gentrification. It's only when displacement happens, right? And progress doesn't automatically mean gentrification, because you can improve the amenities and the number of residences within a community without displacing people who want to be there. I think the idea of gentrification comes from thinking that there's limited power, and the only way to gain power is to take power from someone else, right? Or the only way to gain access to a community is to replace someone who was already there. And so I think that that's important for us to understand, is that we can be different without displacing people. And the other part of gentrification, which is very important, I'm glad that you guys are doing the training, is when we come into a community and we want to change the identity of the community. Yeah. It's awesome to be able to move into a neighborhood because we want to experience and take part in the heritage and the rich history that's already in that neighborhood. It's very different when we come in and we want to rebrand. You know, all we want is the space. We just want the land. We don't want the people, the neighbors, the history, the practices that go with it. And so I think the great opportunity that people of faith have is that I see these different efforts, whether it be around housing, as you're talking about this week, or supporting educators, as Reverend Cheney was talking about last week. We do all of these things as a form of discipleship. Right? It's part of our faith journey. We don't serve God over here on Sunday, and then on the other days of the week, we sort of step out of that mindset and do this. We love people because we're loved by God and we're on this journey. And so that means that the way that we do things is as important as what we do. And so as we are embarking on these journeys to be a part of the affordable housing solution, we're praying, right? We're seeking God. We're asking God, where are my own biases? Help us as individual people of faith and as congregations of faith to see where some of these systemic issues that create gentrification and other things may be present within ourselves, so that we can provide a different example to our community. So I love that you guys are doing that. I love that you're providing that class and saying, hey, for people who aren't part of DC or have not been so far, we welcome you, but it's important for us to be able to help you do this in a way that complements our faith, right? It's just. It's right, it's fair, and it promotes equity as opposed to displacement. And so say a little bit about how would somebody take part in that class if they were interested?
Yeah, so there's kind of a series of different kind of educational programming that we are offering at Just Homes, and actually rolling out a lot of new stuff this year. The best way to keep up to date with that is to get on our mailing list, on our newsletter. And so you can go to justhomesdc.org and sign up for our newsletter.
Type that in the chat.
We also just across social media, so Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at Just Homes DC. We post all sort of upcoming trainings there. We offered the Housing, Race, and Justice class in February, and we'll be planning to do it again probably sometime this summer. We have our next upcoming workshop is on homelessness and housing justice. So specifically kind of how do I be a good neighbor to everyone in my community, especially those who have a different sort of life life experience than I do. So unhoused neighbors, and how do I live in solidarity with unhoused neighbors? We're doing a workshop on that May 4th. So that's coming up. And throughout these, we kind of offer just places to learn practically, but also just for conversation about this. Because you said, like, we don't talk about these kinds of things too much, and not within the faith community. I think, like, I've gone to so many discussions on gentrification, right? But like, how often do we talk about that in the church? We don't really that often, especially in a kind of a multicultural context too. And so there's a lot, I think, that we can learn from each other, really. And one of the things that I love about the Just Homes workshops is that I'm constantly learning from the people who participate, because we're really trying to just create a place for a conversation. And that goes for like anyone, that you're in touch with, Sean, that's, you mentioned people all over the world. Like, if you're doing something interesting and innovative in the housing space that you think we can learn from, like, we want to learn from you. Like, we need to be figuring all of this out together. Like, innovation happens when we can all learn from each other and share with one another. Like, we really, at Just Homes, it's really like trying to create a more collaborative atmosphere as we are trying to solve these really challenging problems. Like, there are some really great sort of interfaith networks that are all working on these kinds of issues together. And so we're just trying to kind of punch up that conversation and make sure that we can be sharing from and learning from one another, because we have the same goal, right? We have the same goal of seeing our communities thrive.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're coming up on our closing here. And so I want to thank you for sharing the contact information. Afterwards, I'll go back into each of the chats, both here on Facebook and on YouTube, and I'll make sure I put that information in there so that people can connect with you guys if they'd like. Any closing words of encouragement for people who may be watching or who may hear about this that might spark that motivation for them to become a part of the housing solution?
Yeah, I want to come back to that phrase of a just city where everyone has a home, and just encourage anyone who's watching to take a couple minutes later today to think about what is a just, if you were to create a just city, if you were to paint a picture of a just city, what would it look like? Like, what would you see? What would you feel? What would you hear? What would be there? What wouldn't be there? I think it's a fun and like kind of brainstorming and creative exercise. And so just take some time to do that, and then start thinking about, like, okay, what's the difference between that vision that I just pictured in my mind and what our reality is? And that will open up for you some ideas of like where God might be calling you to get more involved. So thinking about what is a just city, paint that picture. I'd love to hear what you come up with. So contact me and let me know what you thought about. But I think it's a valuable exercise as you kind of to try to, I don't know, jog some excitement about getting engaged, or think about where God might be calling you to get more engaged in your community.
I love that. Thank you so much, Shiri. Again, I just echo that God has called us to stand in the gap. And so just think about that. You may be the solution that's in that gap between the reality of what could be a just home where housing, a just city where housing is available for everyone, and the reality where we have some people who don't know where they're going to be sleeping tomorrow. And so thank you, Shiri. Again, thank you to all of us, all of you who joined us today for this episode of Wisdom Sparks. We're here every Thursday at 12 noon, and our idea is to share wisdom with people and organizations of faith so that an idea may be sparked, or innovation or motivation may be sparked in you to become a part of the solution to whatever the challenge is in your community. So join us next week. Next Thursday, we're going to be we have our special guest. We're going to be talking about providing service and support to the Asian community. She's out of Los Angeles, and we're going to be talking, this is a pretty tense time, especially when we talk about the treatment that Asian Americans are receiving here. And so we're going to talk about that a little bit. And we're going to talk about the role that the church can play in advocating for people who have been marginalized and are being mistreated. And so we invite you to join us back next week as we for the next episode of Wisdom Spark.